dainty with a trim figure. So, yeah, 70 pounds. So, well, and that was the other funny thing was her family's not very. Her sister has a pit bull. Her mother has a plot hound, and in our heads they're as big as she is. Well, we get down there and they're half the size she is. Like, memory is a funny thing. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, okay. So it is probably a good thing we don't actually have kids because I'm paranoid. I have a GPS tracker on her collar. Now, to be fair, she didn't actually get that far that I needed it. We went around to the outside, and she was just like, "Oh, hey, there you guys are. Let's go." So, but no, I have a GPS tracker Fitbit thing for her on her collar, and so, huh? She's chipped. She's chipped. She's tagged, and she's low jacked. Like, I got it. She is. So she is. Well, she's a good dog, and she's been good to us. All righty. That is not the Bible class. That's the Bible class. All right. We got a couple people rolling in, so we'll let them start getting in. Well, it's a new year, and we're starting a new Bible class. And I've taught this class at every congregation that I've worked with. It's one of my favorite classes to teach because you are responsible for your own faith. Okay? You are responsible for your faith. And you can listen to me, you can sit in the Bible class when Tommy and Belafont and Greg teach and Mark, but at the end of the day, you're going to have to answer for what you believe and how you live. So it's kind of a big deal, right? And at some point in your life, you need to sit down and figure out why you believe what you believe. You can be right without knowing why you're right. Do you realize that? You know, you can be doing the right thing, but not fully understand why it's the right thing. But also, when we deal with people out in the world, when we seek to be who God has called us to be, Peter talks about the fact that we need to be able to give a reason for the hope that is in us, an apologia, a defense. But more than that, we need to be able to explain to somebody why. And it better not be just because my preacher said so. And it also ought not to be because I read it in a book or I saw it on the internet. It's funny, I saw a thing the other day that, back in the 90s, everybody was saying, don't believe what you read on the internet, right? Now it's like you're having to tell people you can't believe what you read on the internet. We've come completely 180. So, but for the Christian, the internet is not what we base our faith on. What Matt says is not what we base our faith on. What some book is not what we base our faith on. The Bible is what we base our faith on. American Express is very famous for its motto, American Express, don't leave home without it, right? For Christians, it can be said that the Bible, don't leave home without it. The Bible is our guide. It contains a history of God's people and the things they've done and the story of God's love for us. It also contains God's will for our life and the things he wants us to do with our life. Now, the Bible is our sole authority. All right, that means that it is the authority. There are some groups out there who have the Bible maybe as their authority, but they might also have a denominational handbook that gives a lens through which they interpret the Bible or they take their belief systems. All right, some groups have doctrinal creeds. like the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. Yeah, Eric. We'll get there. That's a couple weeks down the road. We'll get, don't worry. You just hold that one. That's a couple weeks down the road. Because really, understanding what is the basis for what you do, what is your authority coming from, is where you have to start. And that's foundational, right? All right. If you have siblings, this happened in your childhood. Sibling comes running in. Mom said, you better stop. Where was the authority for that statement coming from? Mom. Anybody going to argue with that authority? No, right? Similarly, in America, we have the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, laws that are on the books that guide what we're supposed to do, right? And sometimes you get engaged with people and talk with people about the Bible, and they don't see it as an authoritative document. They see it as just a book. They see it as just, maybe a self-help book, right? And there's a comedian, and he's not a Christian, but he makes a very good point of having an argument with somebody about the Bible who doesn't believe in the Bible would be about like arguing that you base your life on Harry Potter, right? So you quote to somebody John chapter 3, verse 16, Acts chapter 2, verse 38. If they don't believe it, you may as well say Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, chapter 4, page 36. Because if you don't take something as the authority and guide for your life, then it holds no bearing. So today, that's where we're going to start, because you have to take that as not only the authority, it's the sole authority, right? Because as I said, there are other groups of Christians who, make sure it's still on. I changed the batteries so it wouldn't run out on me, but you just never know. But there are other groups who, they take the Bible and then maybe what a group of men or a man says about it, or has new revelations or new prophecies. And I would suggest to you that God designed it, that the Bible is the standard, the authoritative document with which Christians are to base their life on and to use as the sole guide for doctrine and faith. All right? Any questions about that? Yeah, Eric. Uh-huh. Yes. Okay, so that's a good question about, well, no, that is not man making bad observations. And we're going to cover that next week. Kick that can down the road. No, it's a good, all right. No. So your question, Eric, is fundamentally, what do I interpret from the Bible, right? That's your fundamental question. What do I follow, right? And yeah. Yeah. So the short answer is we're New Testament Christians, not Old Testament Christians. That's the, yeah, that's in the Bible, right? In the book of Acts, Peter is told that the old law has been done away with, right? And in several places in the book of Acts, we find reference to you no longer, you can look at the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15, that you had some Jews who were trying to force New Testament, Gentile Christians, to keep the Ten Commandments and the old law. And they got together and they were like, no, that's not what we do. And I would also state that there is not a commandment that is not restated in the New Testament that we are, anything we are supposed to follow, so the 10 Commandments are more or less restated in the New Testament. The only one would be the Sabbath. Yep. So, all right. So that's the short answer, but we're going to go into more depth later. So don't think I'm putting you off. It's like this is one of those situations you're going to see me with notes because I have a lot of notes and we've got notes to get through. For today and today only, we are going to be focused on establishing two things. Number one is that the Bible is perhaps the best preserved document in written history, and that it stands up to what we know of secular history. And then secondly, that the Bible is inspired by God, because that's ultimately what dictates whether or not it's an authoritative document. There are books that are associated with Christians, and those books are not considered inspired. They were written by men, right? You can go to Walmart right now, and there's a Christian section, and there may be Bibles, but there's also probably 30 other books about Christianity and faith and those kinds of things. 0 out of 0 of those books are inspired by God. They may reference the Bible, but God did not inspire them. All right? So a couple of things. Terms. All right? So you're going to hear me use the word autograph. All right? When I talk about an autograph, I'm not talking about, ooh, he got Jimi Hendrix's autograph, right? He's got Nolan Ryan's autograph. I don't think I have Nolan Ryan's autograph. I got a couple of baseball autographs. That's not one of them. So you're going to hear me talk about that. You're going to hear me talk about something called the documentary hypothesis. There is a theory out there that the first 5 books of the Bible weren't actually written by Moses, and there's a theory out there that the Gospels weren't actually written the way we think they are. And again, the short answer is that is an incorrect assessment of Scripture, all right? God gave us the Bible, all right? But there are people who identify as Christian who don't think that Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And that's problematic, and we'll talk about it, okay? You're going to hear me use the word historicity. Taught this one time, and somebody said, that is not a real word. Very educated person. I said, I'll wait while you Google it. It's a real word. Historicity is the historical accuracy of something, okay? Is it an actual historical fact or event? You're going to hear me use the word inerrant, which means without error. You're going to hear me use the word inspiration, which means given by God. You're going to hear me use the word revelation, which is revealed by God. You're going to hear me use the term manuscript, which all that means is a copy. You're going to hear me use the word papyrus, which is paper made from plant. You're going to hear me use scribe, which is a human copyist, somebody who copies documents for a living. You're going to hear me use the term vellum, which is paper made out of skin. Vellum. V-E-L-L-I-U-I-M, I think. Yeah, vellum. Yeah, I speak funny. It's all right. Then you're going to hear me maybe use the word verbal dictation. All right? Verbal dictation is the idea that God, up above, took the writer's hand and basically made them write everything the way exactly he wanted it. Okay? That is one of the popular theories about the inspiration of the Bible. The second popular theory, and the one that I subscribe to, is called the verbal plenary inspiration, which is that God controlled the ideas and the truth, but he allowed the individual to let their own flavor come through. That's why John writes in very simplistic Greek, whereas a Paul writes in more complicated language, right? Because if God was dictating everything, we would kind of expect a little more consistency in the language. Sarah, when we're driving, will text for me sometimes because somebody will text, Belafonte will text me or something like that, or her sister or a friend. And obviously, I don't want to be texting and driving, so she will become my amanuensis, which is my writer. And I have to tell her what to write, because if she wrote what she thought I should write, they would sound completely different. And so that's kind of the difference, all right? Any questions on those words or terms? Just definitions, okay? All right, so let's get into the actual Bible, all right? It contains 66 books. There are 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 books in the New Testament. The Jews count the Old Testament differently. So if you ever hear someone talking about the Old Testament and their numbers don't add up, it's okay. Because we have 1st and 2nd Kings. They have kings, right? So, they combine some where we separate them out, all right? It was written by 40 authors over a period of 1,600 years. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew. The New Testament was written in Greek, specifically was written in Koine Greek. So for the longest time, we had these manuscripts of the Bible, copies, and we were looking at the Greek and we went, this doesn't make sense. Okay, we get that it's Greek, but this is not how Greek is supposed to look, right? It's kind of like if you were to suddenly take the kids' text messages and it's like, what is this garbledygook? This makes no sense. And so for a period of time, the prevailing theory was, it's Holy Spirit Greek. And then at some point, somebody made the connection and went, no, it's Koine Greek, which was the common language of the day, right? So just like in English, we have formal English and we have informal English, right? So, Zach, if I wanted to formally engage in conversation with Zach, I would go, Zach, how are you doing today, sir? Awesome. Formal. What's up? Right? Informal. Same premise. Same question, formal versus informal. Okay? So the New Testament was written in informal language. And you go, why? Well, let me ask you this. When you're dealing with people, do you speak in formal language more often than not? No. We speak in slang and common English, and you might even have phrases that only your family uses, right? And that's the way the Bible, the New Testament, was written. And you go, why? Well, how is it going to reach the most people? If it's written in a language that most people would use. And so that's a cool thing about it. Now, in the Old and the New Testament, there are what's called Aramaic phrases. So Aramaic was probably the language that Jesus spoke, okay? So he knew Hebrew, and he would have probably known Greek, but Aramaic was the verbal language of the day, and every now and again you get Aramaic phrases that pop out, right? So like we think, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, right? That's an Aramaic phrase. My God, why have you forsaken me? So that's a little just basic facts about the Bible. You probably have heard some of those. Any questions on those? Okay. If we have questions, you can ask. We can always go backwards. That's fine. The goal of this class is for you to get as much out of it. All right. Yeah, I'll do this one. There are pop quizzes at certain points in this class. Do we have, and let me make sure I use my terms correctly. Do we have any autographs of the Bible? Any original copies? Like, do we have marks? You got one back there. Tommy's going, nuh-uh. Any other votes? All right. No, we don't. We have no original copies. Not a one. We don't have an original copy. All right. Now, at first glance, though, you would go, well, how can we trust the Bible? Right? Because I've played telephone before, right? Well, we've all played telephone, right? What starts as the dog ran over the hill. By the time it gets to the end of the telephone, is Johnny went to 31 Flavors and got ice cream with Susie last night. That is not the original, right? That's the fear. And that's a legitimate fear, okay? But what I will tell you is this. The Bible is probably one of the most attested documents that we have in existence, okay, of antiquity. All right? You may have heard the term Pliny, who was a person of antiquity who wrote around 61 AD. All right? So 61 years AD, so this would be 30 years-ish after Jesus' death, okay? So he wrote it in 61. Our earliest manuscript copy is from 850 AD, okay? So there's a 750-year gap between when it was written versus the copy that we have, okay? And there are 7 copies of it in existence. 7, all right? Go down to a guy named Herodotus. Yes, sir. They're all varying. I don't know what variants there are between the copies, but there are 7 copies with or without variants. All right? Herodotus, who was a historian, one of the first historians, he wrote in 480, 425 BC. Okay? The oldest copy that we have is from 900 AD. That's a 1,300-year gap. All right? There are 8 copies of that in existence. All right? Thucydides. All right? I have a history degree, if you did not know. And one of the books that we have to read is Thucydides, A History of the Peloponnesian War. All right? So if you've ever read like Band of Brothers by Stephen Ambrosia, or, any of the books on the Revolution or anything like that, the Civil War, think that kind of book, okay? So the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides wrote it, all right? He wrote it around 460 to 400 BC. Our newest copy is from 900 AD, or our oldest copy, and it's 1,300 years old between the two, right? There are 8 copies. Now, Homer wrote the Iliad. You may have read that in school, right? Which is not, the Iliad is not actually like history, but it's an old book, right? There are maybe 1,700 copies that we have of it. And the oldest dates from 500 years after it's written, okay? I share all that information not for you to remember it, but for you to understand that when we're talking about antiquity, right? You've all seen like books and papers. Like we've all got that paper drawer or part of the house, and you go and you pull out something from 1997, and more often than not, that paper's got a little tinge to it, doesn't it? Paper yellows and it degrades, right? Because it's made from wood pulp, a lot of what we use. Well, papyrus is made from grass. It degrades over time. And vellum, a little bit better. So it stands to reason that we have so little of these existing copies. So we come to the New Testament, okay? The New Testament, which is what we base our faith on, was written between 500 and 100 AD, okay? Now, okay, I got to phrase this correctly. You have manuscripts, and then you have what's called a fragment, okay? So, for example, you just rip a page out of a book, that's a fragment, right? So we have fragments. Our earliest copy of a book comes from 126 AD, okay? Our earliest fragment comes from like 100 to 125 AD. So within 50 years or so of when it was written, okay? It's P52. I have seen it in person in Houston. And so our earliest fragments of the New Testament are from less than 100 years after it was written. So you have Thucydides, which our earliest evidence is 1,300 years. The New Testament, it's 100, okay? Thucydides has 8-ish copies, probably 20 now, since I've done the research. All right, we have 5,683 manuscripts of the New Testament. And then when you add in the fragments, it comes up to about 10,000 fragments, right? Homer's Iliad has about 1,700 copies, 10,000, right? You get what I'm going at here? There is so much, like they thought it was so important to preserve the New Testament that we have copies upon copies upon copies upon copies. Now, our first, full New Testament, full Bible, it is much, much later, right? That's going to be Codex Sinaiticus, I think, and that's around 1000 AD. But back then, you got to remember, you didn't do a book like this. That's not how they did it, okay? In the first century, Paul is writing a letter, 1 Corinthians. He's writing it like we'd write a letter, right? And it's on parchment. And then they'd roll it up or fold. There is evidence of folding. And then they'd send it off. And then you have this letter, right? And then somebody would make a copy of that letter, and then they'd send it on to the next church to read the letter to the Corinthians. And then they would send it on, and then they would send it on, and then they would send it on. All right? So books, the way we think of them, it wasn't like this. They were eventually compiled into books like this, but originally they're just loose documents, okay? And again, one of the reasons why that we have so many fragments and manuscripts is because they thought it was so important, all right? They thought it was so important. Any questions about that? All right, tangent time. Matt gets to go be a little history nerd. So that's the New Testament, okay? But God inspired the Old Testament, didn't he? He did. And our earliest, for the longest time, our earliest copy of the Old Testament came from like 1000 to 1200 AD. Most of the New Testament, is like 2000, 3500 AD, somewhere in that ballpark, and then newer, right? So you're talking a period of 2000-ish years between copies. I don't know about you. I had write-offs when I was in school, right? And didn't have to laugh at that, Bellefonte. And I will go ahead and tell you, write-off number 1 and write-off number 247 looked a little different, right? Because at about 100 write-offs, the eyes start blurring together, and if you've never seen what the manuscripts look like, imagine having to handwrite your Bible, right? And that font, right? Maybe a little bit bigger, right? It's hard, and it's not like you had huge overhead lights. You had lamps and stuff like that, right? And so for the Old Testament, we've got this big gap until the 47, right? And a little shepherd boy is goofing off one day, and he's throwing rocks, as young boys do, and then he hears the sound no young boy wants to hear, the sound of something breaking. Now, there is no He's throwing rocks into a cave. There are no windows in the cave. So he goes to investigate, and he finds all of these clay jars. All right? He finds all of these clay jars, and in these clay jars are papyri. All right? Which is the plural of papyrus. So there's all these documents. Now, some of the documents are very boring. 4 coats, spent 30 shekels with so-and-so, very boring stuff. But some of them are copies of books of the Bible, like the book of Isaiah. It became known as Qumran, the Qumran scrolls, because they came from a local Jewish community, Qumran. You know it as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, here's the cool thing about it, though. All right, the Jews took the preservation of the Bible, the Old Testament, very seriously. If they got one little swoosh wrong, they destroyed the entire scroll. Okay, so the Isaiah scroll from Qumran is, I think it's 2nd or 3rd century BC. Our next oldest copy is from around 1000 AD, so like say 1200 years difference, okay? You would expect in 1200 years of copying it, somebody made a mistake somewhere. They line them up, they match line for line, letter for letter. Perfect preservation. That's cool. That's God. That's God, and that's a commitment to the transmission of the text. Now, when we get to the New Testament, there are some what we call variants, where it looks as though somebody left a word out, or they added a word twice, or things like that. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But what I want you to understand, and what I want you to take away from, is the Bible is one of the most attested documents that we have in antiquity. Like, if you took the religious connotation away from the Bible and just looked at it as a historical document, it is a well-preserved historical document. That's all I'm wanting you to take away from that, okay? Any questions up until this point? Yeah, Eric. Old. $5 word for old. History, in history, antiquity, right? Tommy? All right, so good question, okay? The synagogues don't show up until much later. That's an intertestament. So that changeover from BC to AD, we call the intertestamental period. All right, that's when synagogue worship shows up, okay? But if you'll remember in the book of 1 Kings, Josiah, right? In the Bible, there's a period of time where they're digging through the temple and they find a copy of the law and they go, "What's this book?" Actually, it's "What's this scroll?" But they unroll it and they go, "We're not doing any of this." And so then Josiah commands its reading, right? And so it's like, well, so you got to think, one, it was very expensive to copy scripture, all right? Each copy was done by hand. And so it may be, and that's what makes the Ethiopian eunuch such an interesting story, because he's reading an Isaiah scroll. You didn't just have one in the home. There would maybe be one copy for the entire community, right? So imagine if we only had one copy of the Bible, right? And it lived here at the building. And so if you wanted to read it, you had to come here, because that's just how expensive they were. So you didn't have a lot of copies floating around. So that's number one. Number two is you have a history of warfare and activity and exile, right? You've got the Babylonian captivity, the Assyrian captivity, right? And they didn't go, yes, the Jews' history, let me keep that. They went, you know what? This looks like it'll be a good torch. Click, And so there wasn't that level of care. That's why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so cool, because Qumran, they knew it. They knew the probability for documents to get destroyed, so they hid those documents in a cave. And so and it's just dumb luck that we found them, or providence of God. You could look at it that way too. Now we have fragments here and there, but the oldest copy we have, now the Dead Sea Scrolls, full copy, was from around 1000 AD. But also, you have the rise of the Catholic Church. We don't know what's in the Vatican Library. They just don't let you go walk through. And what happened during like the Crusades and stuff like that is they would come in and they go, this has some value, and they would ship it back to Rome. Belfont? Yeah.
God is going to make sure that we get his commands, his word.
Absolutely.
You said about how expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Like when the Ethiopian eunuch purchased that scripture, he was purchasing it for his queen, or
For him, probably. So the Ethiopian eunuch is in the royal court, right? He's a rich dude, right? And so, and you stop and think about it. He's a rich dude who is, a believer, and he is so much a believer. Now, somebody could have loaned it to him. It could have happened. But the odds are good that he, in Acts chapter 8, he's bought this scroll, and that's his personal copy. And it would have come at great cost to him, So, yeah. Yeah. And, things have flipped, right? You go and you pay $30 for a Bible, right? Can you imagine if you had to pay $1,000 for every book of the Bible? That's what we're talking about, okay? So if you want to like a dollar value, think about like, $1,000. People will go pay $1,000 for an iPhone, right? $1,200 for an iPhone because they think it's important. So would you pay $1,000 for a New Testament book? Say, oh, I'm going to get Luke because it's longer. Mark feels like I got shortchanged, And Belafont's got, so within all of this, and I should have said this at the beginning, and by the way, we are not going to finish everything every week. So if it feels like we stop in the middle of something, that's okay. That's intended. We're talking about all of this evidence, and we're actually going to talk about the historicity of the Bible here in a moment. There is never going to be enough evidence for everybody. All right? Not ever going to happen. All right? That's why it's called faith. Right? Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1 tells us that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Right? You take the evidence that you believe, that you have, and at a certain point you go, I got to step out on faith. And so it's important to keep that in mind, right? So even though we don't have an original autograph of the New Testament, of the books of the New Testament, that doesn't mean that we can't trust it. That doesn't mean that God didn't have a hand in making sure that we got what we needed today. And as we go and we talk about things, and we're going to talk about variants and stuff like that when we get into interpretation, the big thing to take away from today is just the Bible is one of the most historically attested books that we have. It just is. Now, whether people believe what's in it, that's a horse of a different color. Mark, did you have a comment? Okay. But let's talk about the historicity of the Bible real quick as we wrap up for today, okay? In 1868, all right? So in the 1800s, there became a big thing about archaeology in the Bible, all right? And in 1868, a guy by the name of F.A. Klein was in Dibon, Jordan, all right? And he discovers a stone, all right? And it is the Moabite stone. You may have heard of it, okay? It contains the most extensive inscription ever recovered from ancient Palestine, all right? And it describes the events recorded from 2 Kings 3 from the other side's perspective. One of the problems we run into is sometimes we run into things in Scripture that we don't have archaeological evidence for, right? And people go, well, if they had really existed, there would be archaeological evidence of it. No, that's not really true, okay? There is an empty lot on my house, next to my house, and you go, oh, Matt's got a nice big spacious lot. You go to Google Maps, and in 2013, there was a house on that lot. But to look at it today, you wouldn't know that, right? So there's a phrase that we use that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. So just because you don't have the aha archaeological dig doesn't mean that it's not true. And the best example of this I have are the Hittites, right? You've heard of the Hittites, right? The Hittites referenced in Genesis, Uriah, the Hittite, okay? For a period of time, people thought the Hittites were made up. Well, you can't believe the Bible because if the Hittites were real, we would have found, evidence of Hittites. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, okay? One day, a guy accidentally discovered the Hittite Royal Library. And so we went from no evidence to all the evidence. And the Bible the whole time was going, so there's this group of Hittites, they live up there, they do this, they do that, while the world was going, until one day they were found. Yeah, up that way. Anatolia, I think, somewhere in that realm. And that just goes to show that there's not going to be evidence for everything, right? That's why at a certain point you got to go, you know what, that's good enough for me. And you take that step out on faith. So you have things like the Moabite stone, all right? That's 1868, okay? In 1993, okay? Zach, when were you born? 2000? Okay. When 7 years before Zach was born, okay? No, 1993, and he was born in 2000. So, all right. They found something called the Tel Dan inscription. It dates from the 9th century BC. It is the first mention of David as king of Israel outside the Bible. Until 1993, there was no extra biblical evidence, extra biblical means outside the Bible, for David. There were people who thought that he was kind of like King Arthur. Maybe there was like a historical guy like that, but it wasn't David, some other guy. And so the Tel Dan inscription, first reference of David outside the Bible. In 1961, okay, in Caesarea Maritima, there is what's called the Pilate inscription. And it identifies Pilate as the prefect of Judea, right? And so I just go, and there's much more than this, but I share all of this to share that the Bible has been repeatedly proved to be historically accurate. Now, are there some things that are maybe not as accurate? Yeah. And there are reasons for that. But again, just because it's accurate doesn't provide conclusive proof, but it does reinforce the historical nature of the Bible. Any last thoughts, questions, or comments before we dismiss for the day? Tel Dan was found at Mount Hermon, so which is cool. There's actually several digs that are run by members of the church, which is an interesting thing. Dale Manor, for the longest time out of Harding, was running digs over in Israel every year. But anywho, we're not done with this topic. We're going to pick up next week. But if you have questions, over the week, think about them, write them down. We'll talk about them next week. But this is kind of the gist of the class. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the background that we need to figure out what we believe. Because if you don't have your authority, how can I tell you you need to be baptized if it's not coming from an authoritative source? All right, we'll dismiss on that note.